Michael sat alone in his dimly lit room, the blue glow of his laptop screen the only source of light. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of his small apartment. He had always been a fan of horror stories, an escape from the monotony of everyday life. Tonight he felt an eerie thrill creeping up his spine. He wanted to read something truly terrifying, something that would make him glance over his shoulder and shiver. His fingers tapped the keyboard, searching for that perfect dose of fear, ghost stories. As soon as he hit enter, the screen filled with results, websites, forums, and blogs, all promising to deliver the scare he sought. He skimmed through the links, looking for one that might be different from the usual recycled tales of haunted houses and urban legends. One particular link caught his eye. The website was simply titled Stories from Beyond. It had a subtitle that intrigued him. Read if you dare. Michael raised an eyebrow and clicked on the link. The web page was stark and unsettling in its simplicity. It featured a long list of ghost stories, each with a cryptic title that hinted at the horrors within. As he scrolled down, a specific story seemed to glow slightly brighter than the others, as if beckoning him. Its title read, The Story That Reads You. He hovered the mouse over the title, his curiosity piqued. As he was about to click, a pop-up warning appeared on the screen, jarring him with its bold blood-red font. Be careful if you decide to click on the link of this story. What you read can happen to you. You will not know what the story is about until you open it and read every single word. Michael chuckled, feeling a mix of amusement and excitement. Nice try, he muttered to himself. It was clearly an attempt to make the story scarier, to add an element of risk for readers. He was no stranger to horror tropes, and this one seemed like a clever gimmick. Despite a nagging feeling that he should just close the page, he couldn't resist. After all, he was in the mood for something that could genuinely creep him out. Fine, let's see what you've got, he said to himself and clicked the link. The screen went black for a moment. Michael stared at his reflection in the screen, waiting for the page to load. It stayed dark for longer than usual, and just as he considered refreshing it, the screen flickered to life. The story began to unfold in blood-red text against a dark background. The title, The Story That Reads You, loomed ominously at the top, almost as if it were pulsing. The story began with an unnervingly familiar scene. A man sits alone in his room, his face illuminated by the glow of his laptop. The wind outside howls and he searches the internet for something to entertain him, something dark to match his mood. Michael felt a chill crawl up his spine. It was almost like the story was describing him at that very moment. He shook his head, dismissing it as a coincidence. Clever, he whispered to himself, intrigued but unalarmed. He continued reading. He finds a website filled with ghost stories, stories that promise to bring fear to those brave enough to read them. One story in particular catches his eye. The story warns the reader, what you read can happen to you. He hesitates for a moment but then clicks, dismissing the warning as a cheap scare tactic. Michael's heart skipped a beat. His eyes darted around his room, searching the shadows for what, exactly? He had no idea, but the anxiety was palpable. Okay, now this is getting weird, he muttered, feeling a trickle of sweat slide down the back of his neck. Yet a part of him couldn't stop reading. As he continued, the story delved into the mundane details of the protagonist's life, details that matched his own. It described a small apartment with creaky windows, a flickering hallway light outside his door, and even a description of the black hoodie he was currently wearing. Michael's hands began to tremble slightly. It was as if the story were peering into his life, recounting the minutiae of his existence. His eyes moved frantically over the words. The man starts to feel uneasy as the story mirrors his own life. He wonders if he should stop reading, close the browser, and walk away. But a voice inside his head whispers, "You must finish it. You must know how it ends." Michael's throat tightened. How did the story know what he was feeling? It was as if it were narrating his thoughts in real time. He wanted to stop reading, to close the tab, but his eyes were glued to the screen, driven by a compulsion that was no longer his own. He read on, and the story grew darker. As he reads, he becomes aware of a faint sound behind him, a slow, rhythmic creaking noise, like the swaying of an old wooden rocking chair. He pauses, his body tensing as the sound grows louder. His eyes shift to the corner of his room, where the shadows gather thick and dark. A chill shot through Michael's body. His room had no rocking chair. There was nothing in the corner but shadows and the dim outlines of his furniture. Still, the sound began to drift into his awareness. Creak, creak. creak. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He turned in his chair, eyes straining to pierce the darkness. Nothing. The corner was empty. Just a trick of the mind, he told himself. But the sound didn't stop. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His pulse quickened as he turned back to the screen. He convinces himself that it's all in his head, a figment of his imagination fueled by the story. But deep down, he knows better. He knows that something is watching him from the shadows. Michael's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at him to close the laptop and run, to break the spell of this cursed story. But he couldn't. His fingers hovered over the keys, paralyzed by the horror and fascination of what might come next. The story continued, relentless in its pursuit. He hears a whisper, soft and chilling, brushing against his ear like the cold breath of the grave. "Keep reading," it hisses. "You have to finish." He glances at his reflection in the laptop screen and sees for a split second another face just over his shoulder, a face twisted in malice, grinning with a hunger that chills him to his core. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the silent room. He could almost feel the breath on his neck, the faintest whisper tickling his ear. His body went rigid, eyes locked on the screen. He didn't dare turn around this time. He was terrified of what he might see, terrified that the story was no longer just words on a screen, but a living nightmare bleeding into his reality. Tears welled up in his eyes as he forced himself to keep reading. He had to know how it ended, even if it felt like he was spiraling into madness. The man, now fully aware that the story is no longer fiction, realizes with dawning horror that it is reading him as much as he is reading it. It knows his fears, his weaknesses, and it feeds on them. The room grows colder, the shadows deepen, and the creaking grows louder, almost deafening. The creaking noise in his room was now unmistakable, as if an old chair were rocking violently back and forth. Michael squeezed his eyes shut, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. "It's not real. It's not real," he whispered to himself, though he no longer believed it. The story's final lines were almost upon him, and he felt a sickening dread. What if it ended with something horrific? What if he became the protagonist of the very story he was reading? He reaches the final words, his heart pounding, his mind unraveling. The creaking stops. Silence fills the room, suffocating and absolute. He dares to look over his shoulder, his body frozen in terror, and then he sees it, the thing that had been watching him all along. Michael froze, every muscle in his body locked in fear. The room was eerily quiet. The creaking had ceased, but the silence was even more terrifying. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned his head to look at the corner of his room, and there it was. A shape materialized from the shadows, growing more distinct with each passing second. It was a figure, hunched and twisted, its face obscured by darkness. But he could see its eyes, glowing, piercing, hungry eyes that seemed to bore into his very soul. A grin spread across its face, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It began to move toward him, inch by inch, dragging its limbs across the floor with a sickening scrape. Michael screamed, scrambling backward in his chair, knocking over his desk in the process. The laptop crashed to the ground, the screen flickering as the story's final line glowed ominously. The story ends, but not for him. For him, it has just begun. The room was plunged into darkness as the laptop screen shattered, leaving only the faint outline of the figure in the corner. It loomed over him, its grin widening as it reached out with clawed hands. And then, everything went black. The next morning, the neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from Michael's apartment. When the police arrived, they found the door locked from the inside. Upon forcing it open, they were met with a chilling scene. The room was in disarray, the laptop shattered on the floor and the walls scratched with what appeared to be claw marks. Michael was nowhere to be found. All that remained was his chair, slowly rocking back and forth, creaking in the silence. No one ever found out what happened to Michael. Some say he was taken by the very story he read, becoming a part of its cursed narrative. Others whisper that if you search for ghost stories on the internet and stumble upon stories from beyond, you might encounter the story that reads you. But be warned, if you click on it, you may find yourself living the tale, facing horrors that go far beyond mere words. For in that story, the end is never truly the end. It is only the beginning of the nightmare.